Hey guys, today in this video I'm going to be talking about all of the things that I grew out in my garden in 2023. I'm going to be going over each plant that I grew, and I'm going to try and give you details about its growth habit and why I like it or why I don't like it. And hopefully this will help you decide what you want to plant in your garden next year. So first we're going to start with daffodils. These come up in our zone 6B about March, at the end of March, and they last through April. And these plants perennialize, which means you can leave them in the ground until the following year and they'll come back. So about every 3 to 5 years you want to dig these up and divide these. And obviously I'm keeping these in my garden because they perennialize and I want to have them come back each year and not have to plant them every year. So I didn't exactly love every variety of daffodil there was, but since I have them already, they're going to be coming back next year and I'm going to try and sell them. I loved most of the daffodils I grew. I tend to pick things that are not the bright yellowy orange trumpet, the usual daffodil that you would see. I like the whites and the creamy yellows and the ones with peach tones and orange tones in them. And so those are things, they're definitely a winner in your yard. They're not a lot of hard work and you can leave them in established beds. You don't have to dig them up every year. And so these are a winner for me. They're pretty easy. And that for me is what really defines a good flower to grow in your garden, is if they have good stem length, they have good color, they come back every year, and they're easy to maintain. Things that are more difficult, you don't want to keep growing because you'll have to fight with it every year. The next flower we're going to talk about is the tulip. The tulip comes in just a little bit after the daffodils, and they're running at about the same time. Of course, they end after your daffodils end, so they're kind of a good blend into the next flower. Tulips are a little bit different here in our zone. We can't leave them in the ground because the way that we harvest them strips the leaves from the bulb, which means that the bulb can't recharge. So you have to dig them up every year. And usually I do this by harvesting the tulip with the bulb intact. So a couple years ago I did a trial on how best to store these in my cooler, and I did a dry storage with the bulb. I did a dry storage without the bulb. I did a water storage with the bulb and a water storage without the bulb. And the best way to store tulips is wet with the bulb intact. So it's almost like you're still providing it that same atmosphere it would get outside, but in a cooler. And so the stems tend to stay sturdier in the cooler this way. The dry storage, for me, they tend to flop. So I don't like, they do recover, but I don't like to have to go through that process. I feel like if you can keep them in a good condition for as long as possible, that's the best way to do it. So obviously there are a great deal of different varieties of tulips. So I'm not going to go over them in this video because that would take way too long, but you can do your research. And I do have a video on every tulip I grew this year and why I did or did not like them, and you can look at those. So these are bulbs that you will have to reorder every year. So they are kind of a cost, but I found that actually the most beautiful tulips were the least expensive ones. I know that's kind of contrary to what you would think, but for me, I like the simple, beautiful ones. The more elaborate, expensive ones tend to be shorter and they tend to be just less vibrant and beautiful. So, I mean, to each his own, you'll have to decide for yourself. But tulips are a definite thing that I have to grow every year because they are so entwined for me with spring and beauty, and so they are just something that I will have every year. The next flower I want to talk about is stock. Stock comes up about week 16, which is going to be May, April, May. And stock is a beautiful flower. that smells so good. It's definitely one that I will be growing this year. The one thing you want to keep in mind with stock is that in our area, in the St. Louis area, it does require shade cloth. If you don't use shade cloth, it gets too hot before the flowers can fully mature and grow, and they will end up stunted or not growing at all. So keep that in mind, that if you're doing stock, you need to have a shade cloth over that row. Dutch iris will be the next thing that will come up in Missouri in 6B. And these are bulbs that you plant in the fall and that come up in the spring, kind of like your tulips and your daffodils. Dutch iris are a great flower. They are, however, not, you can't perennialize them because you have to cut them pretty much at the base of the flower, which again would leave that bulb uncharged. So don't think that if you cut them to the ground, they're going to come back the next year. Flowers have to have leaves in order to regenerate their bulb. So anytime you're removing those leaves, you're taking away that energy. But Dutch iris are pretty cheap and pretty sturdy flowers. They're actually pretty wonderful. So it's not such a horrible thing to not have them come back the next year, to have to pay that cost again. Bearded iris come up just a little bit after your Dutch iris, and they tend to all come up kind of at the same time. You may have a week between varieties, but they're pretty much come and gone within, I want to say, 2 to 3 weeks. Bearded iris smell amazing. I had no idea. To me, they smell like what I would describe sunshine as smelling like, and all varieties that I grew this year had the same smell. You want to harvest bearded iris when they are not fully open. So bearded iris will have 3 or 4 flower heads on them, and what you want to make sure that each of those flower heads are in the pencil stage. You can harvest with maybe 1 flower open, but once they open, they are very susceptible to bruising and damage, and so you want to make sure you have as few open as possible while still allowing for those other blooms to be able to bloom before the plant dies. So not a very long in the vase life, but because they have multiple blooms, they do last long, if that makes sense. Sweet Rocket comes up just a little bit after your bearded iris comes up. And Sweet Rocket is also known as Dame's Rocket, and it can be invasive in some areas, so you really need to be careful. You need to research that before you grow it. I'm not concerned about it being invasive in my area because I cut it before it goes to seed, and then I whack it down so it can't go to seed once it's done, and I mow my lawns and I cut everything down so nothing's gonna get too out of control. Sweet Rocket is a great cut flower. It gets really tall, and the kinds that I grew this year were a dark purple and a light purple, and I think I had a little bit of white in there too. It was kind of a mix, but it's a great cut flower. It lasts long in a vase, and it's definitely one that I'm going to be growing again this next year. Anemone are your next flower that's going to come up. Now, these actually do start coming up with your tulips and your daffodils, but they're not really in full swing until about week 18 of your growing season here in St. Louis area. Anemone come as corms, which is kind of like a tiny bulb. You can think of them in about the same way. So I plant my anemone in the fall, and I do not pre-sprout. I just stick them straight in the ground, and I provide them with some Agribon cover for the winter. You could try plastic too. I haven't done that yet, but the Agribon works just fine, so that's what I've been sticking with. I have tried to leave my anemone in the ground for multiple years. My problem has been that the weeds kind of take over my anemone bed and strangle out some of those anemone corms. Not all of them are coming back from year to year, and so I am starting to rethink my anemone plan, and I might try ordering them every year instead of trying to keep them in the ground year after year, because they just don't make it as well as they would if they were brand new corms. So this year I am keeping some of my old, and I've also bought some new, and I'm going to see how they compare to each other. They are kind of on the expensive side, so I hate to have to buy them year after year, and I hate to waste. but I also hate to waste a whole growing bed that is only growing half of what it could be growing, if that makes sense. So if you decide to do anemone, you're going to want to do some experiments of your own and see which method works for you. Cress is the next flower that we're going to talk about. This is used as a filler for your arrangements, and cress comes up about the same time as your anemone would. And this year I grew about 5 to 6 different kinds of cress, and the ones that worked best for me were the wrinkled, crinkled, and the Persian cress, which is what you see pictured here. It's this stuff on the right that has kind of those round seed pods and white flowers on them. I liked these two the best because they had the best stem length and they had the prettiest texture, I feel like. And I would grow these again, except for that not many people are interested in it. So it is a good flower filler, but if you're looking for something to sell to like a florist or in wholesale, it's not a good choice. And also, I have to say, it has a pretty distinct smell. Peony also come up as the same time as anemone and the cress. And for me, I only had a couple plants that were in their second year. This particular peony is called Primavera, and it was in its first year, so it's actually doing pretty good. And actually, you want to take the buds off of your first year peony and maybe even your second year peony. I did not because I wanted a picture of at least one of my kinds of peony. So I won't get good photos off of these for a couple of years, but they are obviously a perennial. They come as a root stock that you plant with the eyes of the root just below the soil. If you plant them too deep, they won't flower, so you've got to be a little careful. They also don't like to be too wet or too dry, really, so you've got to really monitor that moisture. We have ours, in this picture you can see the weeds are pretty bad, but we have ours now covered in mulch so that they will be protected in the next coming years. So the thing you want to keep in mind with these peonies are that they are an expensive investment, first of all, and that they take 3 to 5 years to really be able to harvest off of them and profit off of them. Iceland poppies and Shirley poppies come up at about week 19 in our area. So just right after your peony and your cress and your anemone. I love Iceland poppies and Shirley poppies, but they are extremely fragile and they don't last too long in a vase, so I feel like they're not the best for retail. If I do grow these in the future, and I'm planning on growing them next year, I will just grow them for myself so that I can enjoy them. They're just a little hard to handle for most people. So this here pictured is an Iceland poppy, and it is part of the Pastel Meadows collection. I did have poor germination on my Iceland poppies, but on my Shirley poppies, I had extremely good germination. So this is a Shirley poppy here. And the thing to remember about poppies, all poppies, is that in our area they do need shade cloth. They do not like our short spring. And I have grown Iceland poppies and Shirley poppies both outside of shade cloth and in, and they do much better with the shade cloth. They get a lot taller, the plants are healthier, and they last longer for you. So if you do decide to grow these, I would recommend you grow them for yourself and not try to sell them to customers. Ranunculus are the next flower that's going to come up about 1 week after your Iceland poppies and Shirley poppies. Ranunculus are kind of like anemone in that they come in a corm form, like a tiny bulb kind of. And you do pre-sprout these if you want, or you can directly plant them into the ground. And depending on your zone, you can plant them in the fall, but we cannot plant them in the fall here because even with frost cloth, they will not survive the winter. So what I do is I pre-sprout and start them indoors, and then I set them outside in about March. You do want to make sure they don't experience a frost after they're out because it will kill back your leafy greens and it will delay the start of your ranunculus. And they do like that long spring. So again, this is another flower that we keep in that shade cloth until they're done growing. Week 20 brings some pretty beautiful flowers to your yard. This is about the time that your flower your garden really gets going. So on the right hand side of this picture is corncockle or agrostemma, whichever way you want to call it. I grew a white and a purple this year, and I really, really love the white, but I didn't like the purple so much. The flower blooms were a little bit more closed and more trumpet-like. So I am not growing the purple again this year, but I am trying a new variety, so we'll see how we like that. But this is one of those flowers that does not like the heat of summer, so as soon as that starts setting in, it's going to die back. So you may get 1 to 2 cuttings off of it before it's gone for the season, but it's definitely a winner in my book. At the same time, we also have Queen Anne's lace growing in the yard. Queen Anne's lace will actually grow all season long from week 20 on until your first frost. So be sure to succession plant this flower because it does have a kind of a lifespan, so it will die out after about 1 or 2 cuttings, and then you'll want a fresh batch of Queen Anne's lace going in your yard. This is a definite win for me too. I will definitely be doing this next year. In this picture, you can kind of see where it's going. I don't have one of it fully blown out, but you get a white domed flower that's just beautiful, great filler for any bouquet. Snapdragon are going at the same time as your agrostemma and your Queen Anne's lace. They are a beautiful flower, a spike flower with multiple blooms going up the spike. And these, there's a lot of controversy on pinching and whatnot. I do not pinch because, again, our springs are short and they really don't like the full heat of summer. And I prefer to get a good, healthy cutting rather than getting too weak cuttings. I find that those second cuttings off of the snapdragons, or when you pinch them, they have very weak stems that might be good for florists decorating like in a bouquet or something, like in a wedding bouquet, like small work, but not in a flower arrangement. So these come in multiple varieties, all kinds of snapdragons. You'll have to research. There's early and there's mid and there's late. I try to pick a few from each category so that they don't all come on at once. The other thing you can do is to succession plant these. But because our springs are so short and the ideal conditions are so limited for time, I start them all at the same time, but I do different varieties so that I'm not trying to harvest everything at once, but so that I get a continuous flow of snapdragons before my window of opportunity ends. And I am growing these next year. Poor Man's Orchid is a new flower that I tried this year, and it's going to come up about week 21. And this collection was something I got from Floret. It was a mix. And so it came with a light purple, a white, and kind of a light pink color. And I loved them, but I could not figure out when to harvest. So I don't know, they're kind of short, but they're beautiful. So again, this is one of those things that I would grow for myself, just for my own enjoyment and not try to sell wholesale. Retail. I didn't do any experimentation with this, and I should have, but I was so busy with everything else. And this was kind of my little experimental patch, so I didn't work too hard on it. But as you can see, they're very pretty. They have orchid-like blooms on them. They're very tiny and dainty, and it's just something I need to work with a little bit more before I decide to really put it in the mix. So if you want to experiment with it, go ahead. You'll probably learn more than I did off of it. But see, as you can see, they're just gorgeous. So beautiful. So I'm not a no on it. I am not growing it next year. I'm just going to give myself some space to think about it and then maybe bring it back in later on. Okay, so next we have yarrow, which are going to show up in week 21, and actually it depends on whether or not you have started your yarrow for the first time or whether or not it has already been in the ground, because yarrow is a perennial here. And in fact, it perennializes really well, and it comes back even taller and better the second year and earlier than it does the year that you start it. So that picture right there is one in its first year. They're not as tall and they don't give you as many stems. They may not do a lot at all actually, but in their second year, they're going to look amazing. So when you're thinking about yarrow, keep in mind that it germinates, I'd say about 75%, 50 to 75%. So you're going to want to sow a lot more than you're actually going to want to put in. It does perennialize and spread, so you're going to want to give it a whole row. I would do a whole row. I wouldn't try to half it. And when you harvest these, you harvest at the base, but because all of the leaf structure is at the bottom, you're not going to kill the plant. It is a dirty flower, so you're going to want to change that water out or get tablets that can clean the water. And yeah, I love yarrow. Obviously doing it again next year because it's already in my ground, so I don't have to plant it again. Rudbeckia or Black-Eyed Susan is also coming up at the same time as your yarrow. This is something also that perennializes well. So, and it actually self-seeds too. So not only will you get their plant that you had the year before, but you'll get some more plants. So you want to give these about 9-inch spacing so they can spread out and drop their seed. So this is going to come up week 21 and it will go until the first frost, as long as you are cutting it back. So as soon as you get a flush of growth, you want to cut it down, and in a couple more weeks it'll do another flush of growth, and it will just keep doing that until the first frost. And actually they can handle a tiny bit of frost. So they're a great one. The ones I like are the milder colored ones. I like the Green Eyes, I think is pictured there. Prairie Sun, and I think the first picture was Indian Summer. Those are a few of my favorite Rudbeckia. I don't tend to like the cherry brandy and the brown ones. Cosmos, also a week 21 flower, are a great flower to have in your yard. They are definitely more of the, they will overtake your yard pretty quick. So these pictures that you're seeing right now are in the first stages of growth. They're really short to the ground, but eventually they get to be about 6 feet tall. So some of my favorite cosmos are Rubenza, Velouette. I like the seashell mixes, and the cupcakes mix I really like. There are a couple of newer varieties that came out this year, apricot lemonade, and I didn't really like them so much, so I'm going to steer away from those. But these are definitely a great cut flower to have. They will go until the first frost. Week 21 is also when you're going to start to see your first roses. Now, these do take quite a while to get to a stage where you can actually harvest off of them and make money off of them. You're going to want to give them 3 to 5 years, kind of like the same with your peonies. They just need that time to develop the root system so that they can provide those beautiful flowers for you. Most of the varieties of roses that I grow are David Austin, so I can speak to their quality. I don't have any from anywhere else, so I can't really talk about other rose quality. The reason I went with David Austin is because I've had really bad luck with roses in the past, and I wanted to be sure that it wasn't a quality problem and not just a me problem. So they're doing fantastic this year. They'll do even better next year, and I will keep you updated on my rose trials. But when you harvest roses, people often make the mistake of cutting too short, and then what happens is you get scraggly stems with heads that the rose can't support. The stem can't support those big heads. So you need to cut deep into your plant when you harvest your roses. I'm going to end this first half of my flower review for 2023 with my favorite flower, the sweet pea. Sweet peas smell so good. Their stems don't get too long. I think the longest stem I had last year was maybe 16 inches. So they just don't like, we have the short spring that they just don't do well in. So I start mine indoors probably in February, and then I set them out after the last frost. So March is a safe bet to put them out. If you see a frost coming, you're going to want to cover them, because what happens if they get a frost after they've been set out is they will die back to the ground. They'll come back, but it will make their bloom time a lot further out in the season, and so they won't reach their peak glory um, in time for that good window of opportunity. So there are so many different kinds of varieties of sweet peas. The one thing I would say is that if you really love a sweet pea, try to keep the seeds, because what I've noticed is that when you go to find the same seed you had the year before, no one's growing it anymore and they're just completely off the market. So if you find one you love, save it, save the seed. I'm going to go ahead and conclude this first half. Thanks for watching, and I hope you join for the second half.